frost around first thing, but quite quickly it'll warm up. The sun will get to work. And it's looking much sunnier for northern and eastern England, for much of eastern Scotland compared to Tuesday. It's still going to feel on the cool side, particularly on the east coast with the breeze coming from the North Sea. But I think with a lighter wind and with more sunshine, it's going to feel pleasant enough. 15 or 16 in the south, 8 to 9 on the east coast of Scotland and eastern England. Now into Wednesday nights, more lengthy clear spells and lighter winds again. So I think a more widespread frost, still in places like Cardiff, London, Southampton, 6 or 7 degrees. But in sheltered spots away from urban centres, those temperatures getting close to, if not below freezing. So a frost on Thursday morning, but another dry and bright start to the day. Another fine day for the vast majority. Just some rain drifting past the Northern Isles there. Otherwise, for much of the country, it's sunny spells, some cloud floating by. And for Friday, a bit more cloud in the sky, but Saturday the sunshine returns, particularly in the southern half of the UK.
Join us on GB News tomorrow as we report on these specialist armed ambulances being converted for transit to Ukraine, where they're currently losing 15 ambulances a day. These specialist vehicles have never been more urgently needed. Ambulances for Ukraine tomorrow on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's 2 questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Michelle Dewberry. It's 6 o'clock and this is Dewbs & Co, the show where we'll get into some of the things that have got you talking tonight. And Russia's top diplomat has warned that NATO is now fighting a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, and apparently there's a very serious risk the conflict could turn nuclear. Got to say that assessment has been disputed by many, but I cannot help but wonder, is it too late for peace? And Elon Musk wants to create a new digital town square with Twitter. Many, though, are saying we need to do more to counter hate speech. But get this, one of my panel tonight thinks that there is no such thing as hate speech. Who's right? And David Cameron has accused Muslim groups who criticise the Prevent Counter-Extremism programme of enabling terrorism. What do you think to that? And calls for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee bank holiday to be made permanent are ringing loudly. I'm going to start ringing those claims as well. And while I'm at it, what about St George's Day? Why not add that? I love a bank holiday, I do, but are we being lazy? And what does all of these mean to the economy? We'll have that and more in just a few minutes, but first, the latest news headlines.
Michelle, thank you. And some breaking news coming to us within the last half hour. A man arrested on suspicion of the kidnap of Katie Kenyon has this afternoon been further arrested on suspicion of her murder. Lancashire police say although Katie has not yet been found, they're now working on the basis that she's no longer alive. The 33-year-old woman from Burnley hasn't been seen since last Friday morning. The Prime Minister has threatened to privatise the Passport Office, according to a senior government source. It's understood Boris Johnson is horrified at the backlog in dealing with passport applications. He's said to be concerned that families wanting to go on summer holidays are under pressure now to pay up to £100 extra per passport to fast-track their applications because of the delays. Public and Commercial Services Union says the threats are absurd and blames casual contracts. A P&O ferry that lost power and was adrift off the coast of Northern Ireland earlier on today has now docked at the port of Larne. A P&O spokesperson said there were no reported injuries on board the vessel after it was affected by a mechanical issue. We're going to go to Larne now and speak to GB News Northern Ireland reporter Dougie Beattie. Dougie, what is the update?
Well, the European causeway has docked and been pulled further up into another port. The European Highlander that usually meets it on the way across has now come in behind as well. There were no injuries on this incident, but the vessel was adrift off the Irish Sea, and it was understood that it was not under command. So that would suggest that there was steering problems with the vessel, and they have brought it up in, and crews have now entered, and we can only assume at this point that they are going to have a look at exactly what went wrong.
Dougie Beattie for the moment. Thanks very much indeed. International news, and Russia says if London encourages Ukraine to strike targets on Russian territory, it will lead to a proportionate response. That's according to Russian state media. UK Defence Minister James Heappey said earlier it would be acceptable for Ukrainian forces to use Western weapons to attack military targets on Russian soil. Meanwhile, the United States has welcomed Germany's decision to send heavy weapons to Ukraine for the very first time. Speaking from an airbase in Germany, US Defence Secretary said NATO leaders will now meet monthly to intensify support for Ukraine.
I applaud all the countries that have risen and are rising to meet this demand. But we don't have any time to waste. The briefings today laid out clearly why the coming weeks will be so crucial for Ukraine. So we've got to move at the speed of war.
Well, all this happens as the Russian President Vladimir Putin is meeting UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres in Moscow right now. The Kremlin leader told him he hopes talks with Ukraine will yield a positive result. More on that story as it happens and comes into us. Now, Downing Street has stressed the need for Twitter, the social media site, to remain responsible and protect users from harm is paramount. Twitter's founder, Jack Dorsey, is welcoming a £34 billion takeover of the company by the world's richest man. He says Elon Musk's bid is the only solution he trusts. Twitter originally rejected the offer, but the board reconsidered when Mr Musk demonstrated he'd secured the finances for the deal. Political economist Dr Stephen McCabe has questioned, though, whether buying Twitter was a good business move for Mr Musk.
Buying a company that, apart from 2 years, 2019 and 18, the year before, has never made a profit. In fact, in 2020, for the where the latest counts are available, made a $1.1 billion loss. So to buy sort of a company such as this and spending it, what's a large amount, $44 billion, is somewhat strange. What's in it for him?
And the tennis player Novak Djokovic will be able to defend his title at Wimbledon this year. That comes after the All England club confirmed players won't need to have had a COVID vaccine to compete. The coronavirus restrictions has only enabled the world number 3 to play 3 tournaments so far this year. On TV, online and on your radio via DAB+. You're with GB News. Now it's time for Dewbs & Co.
Thanks for that, Polly. Well, keeping me company until 7 o'clock tonight. My panel, we've got historian and broadcaster David Starkey, journalist Benedict Spence, and Polly Mackenzie, who's the chief exec of Demos, a think tank, and a former advisor, nonetheless, to Nick Clegg. Good evening to you three. And you know the drill at home by now, don't you? It's not just about us and our thoughts. It's about you at home as well. What's on your mind tonight? You can get in touch with me on email, gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can tweet me at Michelle Dewbs or at GB News. Don't forget, of course, if you haven't already, you can subscribe to us on YouTube. We've got an app. We're on the DAB Plus radio. We're everywhere. That's the short version. So wherever you are very welcome this evening. Gordon, you are my first email in tonight. You say, Michelle, whatever happened to sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me. I guess you're speaking about the Twitter conversation. Is there such a thing as hate speech? By the way, Gordon, so quick your fingers were. You wrote, whatever happened to stocks and stones? But I know what you meant. You meant sticks. And I've got to say, I tend to agree with you, actually. Do words hurt people? Can't wait to hear your thoughts on that one. Anyway, let's get into our top story for tonight, shall we? A top Russian diplomat has warned there is a real danger of a third world war breaking out after a day of apparent Ukrainian attacks on Russian soil. Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, says that there is a threat that the conflict could turn nuclear. He also says that NATO is fighting a proxy war with Russia by supplying heavy weapons to Ukraine with the goal of wearing down the Russian army. I'll start with you, shall we, David? I mean, so much to unpick on this. There's been a lot of kind of criticism of that description in the first place. James Heapy, the minister we've just been talking about, the news headlines, actually, he disputes this. He's saying an escalation is not on the cusp. I start thinking about peace. Are we anywhere even close to reaching peace? Has that now gone to the long grass? Your thoughts?
I think the answer is absolutely not. There's no chance. You're dealing with peace. You're dealing with two absolutely different visions of the same piece of territory. In many ways, it's very much like what goes on in Palestine. You've now got two radically different views of what is right in that territory. You've got the view of Russia, in fact, Tsar Putin, Tsar Vladimir, thinks that it's part of a greater Russia. The Ukrainians are inventing a nation. You know, we're witnessing something completely extraordinary there. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a great film. This is a new version. It's the birth of a nation. So there's an absolute conflict over a notion of right. Mm-hmm. We, of course, in the West have waded into it. I am astonished in some ways that Lavrov has left it as long as he has for saying what he has. We have been from the very beginning. And I think it's also very important that we in Britain have been particularly active. The alliance against Russia is really the alliance of the old British Empire, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the oldest bit of the British Empire, the United States. Europe has been a very reluctant partner, save for the former communist states like Poland and the Baltic states. So we've been playing a very prominent role. It's a very risky role. And we should honestly be aware of the risks.
And when you say we, by the way, what are you talking about? The UK? Are you talking about NATO? The West generally? Who's we?
I've tried to explain. It's the most active powers have been America and Britain. Mm-hmm. They have been the ones who've spoken most loudly. If you look at news from Moscow, it is the idea that Russia is now being attacked by the unholy alliance of London and Washington. We really are. We don't think of it. We feel cosy. You know, it's a lovely spring day. All of this seems a very, very long way away. It's not. The missiles are close. They are terrible. There's been a huge amount of loose talk, you know, dragging Putin before some sort of world tribunal, a new Nuremberg. The only reason that Hitler was dragged before Nuremberg, and he wasn't, the only reason why it was hoped to, was that there was a policy of absolute German unconditional surrender. You were fighting total war. We're playing very dangerous games, and I think really Lavrov is rather sensible to point the fact out.
Do you agree, Polly?
I think it's certainly an incredibly dangerous time, and our involvement in Ukraine is plain for all to see. I think Germany and France have been actors. You know, Germany has made, even though in some ways on energy policy they've been dragging their feet, they have nevertheless made quite a shift in their foreign policy, their defence stance from, you know, the very recent days of Angela Merkel. And all of those countries, plus the US, Australia, as David mentions, we're involved, and we can't pretend that away. But the moment Russia crossed the border into Crimea in 2014, the moment that Russia sent chemical weapons and basically supported the carpet bombing of Aleppo and other parts of Syria, and the West decided to do nothing, we were in a way, you know, enabling this increasing escalation, because I think Putin became more and more confident that we would do nothing. And in a way, doing nothing and saying, you know, this is a power that we cannot contend with is one choice. What's odd is for us to have said, tried to draw a line in the sand and then moved it and moved it and moved it. And I think what's tricky now in terms of diplomacy is that we waited so long that the escalation becomes very dangerous. I don't think that there will be an exchange of nuclear weapons, but nevertheless, the risk and the threats is a sea change. Certainly something that is, you know, we've not heard in my adult lifetime, certainly.
Polly, can I just come in 1 second?
You may.
Isn't the real key difference that there was somebody like Zelensky? Zelensky is a completely new figure in the politics we've been used to. He is somebody who talks with the voice of a Churchill. And in fact, he ventriloquizes Churchill astonishingly effectively. And this is what I'm saying. We are actually seeing something visceral, profound. There are all sorts of things we've decided were very bad things. Zelensky is archetypical masculinity.
I think you're completely right.
But
it's interesting to see.
Toxic masculinity.
But he ventriloquized Churchill to us, and then he gave a speech
to Lincoln, to America.
Lincoln to America, to the Bundestag. He was talking about German history. He's an incredibly clever politician, and in the run-up to this, we totally underestimated him. We should have been arming Ukraine a decade ago, and instead what we did is we are rushing weapons in at the last minute. They haven't had the time to do enough training, and it means that, you know, the escalation is incredibly dangerous.
Benedict?
I mean, it's fascinating in many ways, because there's also the conflict in Ukraine is just a continuation of a centuries-old conflict between Russia and whoever is the dominant power in the West. For a very long time, that was Germany. Before that was France. Obviously, it was the British Empire. Now it's the United States. But it is the start, I think, in my personal opinion, of pulling apart within Europe of actually where the key power is. And I would depict this more as the beginning of a Slavic century. You're going to have one pole, which is going to be Moscow, and you're going to have another one, which is going to be based in Warsaw, and around it you're going to have two of the three other Visegrad countries. Hungary finds itself in a very difficult position, but the most vocally aggressive countries outside of the UK and the United States have been Poland, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. They are the ones sending the heavy weaponry. Also the Baltics to a lesser extent. But it is predominantly now, I think, the advent of a rise of power in Eastern Europe. And in many ways, actually, the refugee crisis benefits countries like Poland, like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia, who were beginning to undergo that little bit of a population crunch. You know, the fertility rates were dropping. Well, now they're going to have an awful lot of people, mainly women and children, who end up being dual nationals. A lot of them are going to end up settling in that part of the world. That's going to be very beneficial to them. But why this is a discussion of why it is a world war potentially rather than just a European war is actually more to do with the countries that aren't doing anything about this crisis. And that is, of course, India, that is China, that is Pakistan, that is Iran. Those are potential major powers who have many fingers and many pies across many parts of the world, and who also rely very directly on Russia for all sorts of key goods. And it is now out of the remit of the old colonial masters or the United States to apply the pressure like they were once able to these countries and say, now you stop that. You know, we've already got Boris Johnson going to Delhi to speak to Narendra Modi and not getting very much out of it. You've got the former now President of Pakistan going to Moscow to kowtow to Putin the day after the invasion had begun. And that is why we're talking about it's a global conflict, because it is the shattering, really, of the American sort of unipolar existence. And lots of other countries now competing in that vacuum that's been created.
But it's really two, isn't it? And you've 2+. It's as always, George Orwell is right. This is basically the geopolitics of 1984. Oceania, which is us, which is, broadly speaking, NATO. A Eurasia, which is this unbelievably flexible frontier in Europe. By the way, it's going back to the 16th century. This territory of Eastern Europe has been fought over between Poland and Russia from the 16th century, with Poland in retreat. Poland-Lithuania ruled all of this, virtually to the gates of Moscow. And then they're rolled back. But again, it is what we've all forgotten is taking place. There is a new power bloc, or rather a renewed power bloc, which is the other great power of China. And China and Russia are hand in glove.
But let me ask you about that, actually, because you mentioned China and Russia. I'd be interested in your take about, obviously we are sanctioning Russia, the Russian people, the Russian economy to within an inch of their economic lives.
Well, sort of. We're continuing to pump in about $1 billion a day, or at least Germany is.
Yeah, I was going to say
Can we just be really honest on this? The situation we've got ourselves in has got a very simple analogy. You see a horrible mugging. You know somebody's going to get killed. By a strange chance, you just happen to have the mugger's credit card. You solemnly cut it up and expect him to stop, but you continue paying him his wages in cash. That's exactly what we're doing.
But do you worry that the sanctions, the more and more we sanction deeper and deeper, that we're pushing essentially Russia to someone like China?
Absolutely. We're creating, there are going to be two banking systems. Russia has been driven out of SWIFT. What it is doing now is aligning its payment systems through China. We are going to see the internet split. China is already substantially cut off from the main internet. Right? It has got its own separate systems, its own separate firewalls. Russia was much more open. That is going to stop. And then there's exactly the point Benedict made. There is, again, Orwell got it absolutely right. There's the parallelogram to the south, the powers of Latin America, of Africa, of Southeast Asia. They're all now, of course, what? They have two sides to play off. It's exactly what they hoped for in the Cold War, but this is one in which the balance is much more even, much more alarming.
Much more alarming indeed. Polly, we mentioned NATO. Of course, there's conversations now. Sweden, Finland, they hankering after joining NATO, applications in the summer. Russia have turned around again and said if that happens, there'll be military consequences. Should we be worried about that?
I think we should be, but the reality is that we are not the belligerent party here. And, David is talking about this shift, which is in a way, tragic, because the economic benefits to the world of globalisation are having to be given up on. Wouldn't it be great if we could just buy anything from anybody and not worry about, the kind of the
who made it, what slave labour was employed, those boring little things. So we get our nice, cheap little pretty T-shirts.
But we've become so dependent. We're utterly dependent on energy resources, and it's of course those resource-intensive countries that tend to be the ones with the worst human rights record.
Except for the Ukraine, third of the world grain, third of grain supplies come from the Ukraine.
And they've got a lot of flat land.
Most of cooking oil.
And where does most of it go?
I think before.
But it's clear, we're having to go cap in hand to Saudi Arabia to ask them to produce more oil because we're so dependent on oil.
Benedict?
We need to change our energy system, most importantly.
This is key, of course, because the war in Ukraine is cutting off grain supplies to most of the Middle East, which is very food insecure. And, when you look at countries like Lebanon that have less than a month's worth of grain, and you look at the political situation and who has political power there, you begin to realise then why it is the discussion of a world war. But I do think actually sometimes we give China a little bit too much credit. it is a very powerful situation, but it is built on a very precarious economic model where, as you see during the coronavirus pandemic, if you start to shut down parts of the economy, it really begins to flail. And, as much as anything else, China is continuing to do that with its zero-COVID policy. You have large industrial centres all along the Yangtze River, which is a third of China's industrial output and about 40% of its population being regularly shut down. That is having knock-on effects on supply chains around the world, but it will hit at home. Above and beyond, as much as we can complain about the cost of living, that is where it will really be brought to bear, and that is on China. So as much as, it is true, actually what we're doing in terms of our economic sanctions against Russia, it's not really having that much of an effect. That is not to say that, undercurrents in the global markets won't have an impact on other sides of the world. And the other thing, of course, is to understand that China is also fighting not really a Cold War, increasingly a hot war on the border with India, which is also doing the same with Pakistan. As much as all of these countries are in cahoots on a lot of things like energy transport, they also exist in a very precarious situation. And there's no guarantee that they will, as much as David does say, and it's right that they are hand in glove, doesn't mean that it will stay that way when their immediate interests
Mick who's watching, saying that David is wrong to say China is hand in glove. And Benedict, you've just repeated it, so Mick obviously thinks you're both wrong. He says it's wrong to say China is hand in glove with Russia because China would never give up trade with the West at the possible loss of living standards for the Chinese people and ultimately the loss, potentially, of control of their country. Quick response to that from you, David, before I move on.
Well, of course, there happens to be very many other populations that China can send its goods to. And it is doing exactly that with its Extraordinary Belt and whatever it is initiative, which is tying up the world in a series of absolute economic knots. And we've been letting it happen because, of course, we have such a complete failure of both foreign policy strategy and economic strategy. The absurd way that we sprayed foreign aid around, as a kind of divine benediction without using it properly or thinking of its purpose. So the result is we're giving vast quantities of international aid to India, which then simply laughs at us.
Well, I'll tell you what I'm laughing at. I'm laughing at you've just touched on one of my favourite subjects I could talk about, the UK's bonkers foreign aid strategy all night, that is for sure. But unfortunately, it's time for a break, so I'll pause that now. When I come back, Elon Musk, of course you will have heard by now, he's bought Twitter. £34 billion as well. A lot of people are upset, aren't they always? Apparently, his ambitions to create a digital town square means that we are going to be covered, I tell you, in more hatred. Is that really right? I'll have that and more after the break.
Join us on GB News tomorrow as we report on these specialist armed ambulances being converted for transit to Ukraine, where they're currently losing 15 ambulances a day. These specialist vehicles have never been more urgently needed. Ambulances for Ukraine tomorrow on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Michelle Dewberry. Welcome back to Dewbs & Co. Keeping me company until 7 o'clock tonight, historian and broadcaster David Starkey, journalist Benedict Spence, and Polly Mackenzie, who's the chief exec of Demos think tank and a former advisor to Nick Clegg. Now, we mentioned this last night, didn't we? Elon Musk, of course, has bought Twitter. He wants to create a new digital town square. What do we think to this? I personally think it's fantastic news. I'm very much looking forward to seeing what he does with it. But lots of people, of course, predictably so, are saying that this is a bad thing, that apparently we're going to see more and more hate speech. And how on earth can everyone be protected from all these nasty, nasty words? Benedict Spence?
I mean, it's sort of fascinating because you've got an awful lot of people who are incredibly het up about this. The idea of Elon Musk owning Twitter as opposed to large Wall Street hedge funds like Blackstone and Vanguard, because, of course, it makes a huge difference, which one of them owns it. I mean, you sort of have it swinging from one side to the other, don't you? Before, when people like Donald Trump were being, kicked off Twitter and right-wing accounts were being kicked off Twitter, lots of right-wing people were saying, oh, it's terrible, we're all going to go set up our own platform. That was Parler and it was a disaster, and everybody on the left thought that was very funny. And now you have lots of people on the left or the centre going, oh no, isn't this terrible? We're all going to go off and we're going to form our own thing. It just doesn't really work. And I think it comes from a sense of hiraeth that exists sort of across the spectrum in the West, which is that there once existed this perfect idyll at the early outset of the internet, where you had free speech, but it was sort of kept in check. And then everything sort of got a little bit nasty, a little bit out of hand, and we need to sort of have constrictions. This can't be said. This should be promoted. There are certain special interests that need to be safeguarded. And realistically, Elon Musk, he, as far as I'm concerned, in a vast pool of very unsuitable people to have any kind of influence over something like Twitter, he's probably the person that I would trust the most, given actually
Did you
what
just
we've
see
had
his dancing on the screen? I mean, if you're listening, not watching, I do apologise because you can't see what we've just been playing, but I've just been showing you a very bizarre clip of him tossing his jacket to his side and doing some kind of
Well, I'm very glad that he doesn't
dancing.
dance very well, because he clearly spends his time doing other things rather than taking up dancing lessons. But I think, really, this is ultimately, it's about control. We touched in the last segment, didn't we, about the fracturing of the global order. That includes the internet, and that includes things like Facebook's metaverse. It's about control over the future of the internet and things like Weibo in China and all of these sorts of things. So actually, it is very important to have, I suppose, custodianship over things like Twitter. We can't exist, actually, in a sort of a wonderful, a democratic idyll like we all like to think that Athens was, where everybody can say their bit and it's all incredibly
Apart from
polite.
Socrates.
Well, exactly. But, you always have to remember what happens in these situations. It never goes that way. It never ends particularly well. There hasn't been a public forum that hasn't essentially been run by special interests or by tyrants. So really, in the grand scheme of things, Elon Musk, is he the best person in the world? Probably not. But I can think of many worse people, including the people, actually, who he has now taken Twitter out of the hands of.
So, Polly, if I move this away from Twitter a little bit, because I know there'll be people at home that say, well, I don't use Twitter. Some people might not even know what Twitter is. Trust me, you're not really missing much if you're one of those. But if we talk more generally about this whole notion of kind of hate speech and what you should be able to say, what you shouldn't be able to say, this kind of town square mentality, should there be limits, do you think, to what people can and can't say?
Yeah, there should be limits. I don't think I should be able to threaten to kill you, for example. But those limits, certainly from government, should be constrained and minimal. I think, being protected, your right to protest, your right to dispute what the government is doing, your right to speak out, including for minority and obscure and controversial opinions, is absolutely central to a democracy. I think it's a bit different, though, when you think about the choices that a private company might make to optimise the user experience for the people who then are either its customers or its product, because, of course, for lots of the social media platforms, you don't pay to use them, you pay, it's the advertisers who pay. But that means you need user engagement. And so you will get platforms like, for example, there are increasingly gaming platforms for kids which are designed to be really quite censored, because that's what parents and children say that they want. We know that teenage girls are interested in and keen on being able to moderate and constrain the environment that is around them, because they know that they are vulnerable to anxiety and mental health problems and abuse. And so what they want from the private sector companies that may or may not choose to provide it is a safer environment, a less hateful environment, a less abusive environment. And it seems to me that for a company to write down some terms of service and say, on our platform, you can do X and Y and Z, but you can't do A and B and C. And then there'll be another platform that's designed for a different customer segment. Parler will have different terms of service than Twitter. And Twitter will have different terms of service than, you know, a Lego platform designed for kids to exchange debates about how to do Lego stuff. And that's OK. You have a free market. And I think the danger is that we sort of act as if Twitter is some kind of like a government thing. There's a difference between my right to have controversial opinions and to speak them out and some sort of sense that a private company is obliged to provide me with a free platform to broadcast my opinions to everybody else, and everybody else has to somehow listen to them respectfully. They're not the same thing.
David, I heard a rumour, gotta love a nice rumour, that you think that there's no such thing as hate speech. Is that right?
Yes, effectively. I mean, I'm on side with Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a First Amendment fundamentalist. He believes, which is the American position, there is no such thing as hate speech in America. Hate speech, again, we've got to understand how the idea of hate speech comes in. It comes in, bizarrely, through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the countries that worked to limit the freedom of speech were the Soviet Union and its satellites. And they work persistently for 20 or 30 years, deliberately because they believe in censorship, deliberately because they believe in censorship and they want to censor. So, for example, the rules that you are not allowed to deny, for example, the Holocaust or to... Why do you hear so much from the Russians about this thing called fascism or the Nazis, even though we would think they're the Nazis and the fascists? It is, of course, because this has been the historic way they have all, after the Great Patriotic War, after the Second World War, their defeat of Hitler, this has been the way they have always argued for the limitation of freedom of speech. So hate speech is really a foreign import into an Anglo-Saxon tradition. English law, until very recently, sharply distinguished between words and action, which is exactly the point that Polly was making. You have no right to advocate violence. But the notion that a statement like, you know, I deny that a trans woman is a woman, is an act of violence and therefore to be banned as violence, this is a perversion of language. And, you know, this station's Andrew Doyle and his Titania McGrath are absolutely wonderful parodies of this. So, and there's another thing that we haven't put in place. At the moment, Twitter has become the principal instrument of online hate. The Twitter storm is the effective vehicle by which people I know are cancelled. It's done by a Twitter storm. And this seems to me to be monstrous, and it is deployed completely deliberately as a device. It's a combination of an inquisition and mob justice. It's an ugly and vile thing. And
But yet it's not violence under your terms.
I think it is. Sorry, if you're on the receiving end of it, yes, it is violent. If you look what was done to... I'm sorry that this...
Okay. I'm just trying to understand the terms of the debate. So if somebody says... If 10,000 people were to tweet at a particular trans woman to say, you're not a woman, you're a man... I hate you, you're awful, for example. You shouldn't be allowed to say...
I think it's slightly different.
So I'm just trying to understand.
That is completely different from what I'm talking about.
OK.
It really is completely different. And if you make the statement, which is a reasonable statement, that I no more believe that it is possible for a man to become a woman by uttering a form of words than I do by, for example, that a piece of bread can turn into the host of body and blood of Christ if a priest says hocus pocus, hoc corpus. this. That is not hate. I merely expressed a reasonable position.
Okay.
On the other hand, what I'm talking about is the use, really, of Twitter as a lynch mob. And it also invites direct action. It deprives people of jobs, of entertainment, because of employment.
But those are then actions. You see, that's what. Whereas the Twitter storm itself is speech, it's criticism. Actions, so for example, that are then people losing out on employment, losing out on opportunities to present their findings or their research. That, to me, it seems that is separately. That is
no, it's not.
Actions promoted for and advocated by campaigners.
Sorry, you really are very. For somebody who once advised Nick Clegg, you're very behind the times on this subject. Haven't you read Barry Weiss on the subject that Twitter has become the effective editor of the New York Times? It is perfectly clear if you look at the publishing industry. Twitter has effectively become the editor of virtually every press. Now, this is monstrous and it's dangerous.
But again, those are actions. So the criticism for me is that the New York Times shouldn't be doing that. I completely agree with that.
What we shouldn't lose sight of is that is actually right. A lot of people's opinions are now formed entirely by what we get on Twitter, but that is affecting institutions, organisations. We see this a lot in academia that are now incredibly rigid and sort of set in their ways and aren't perhaps, sort of the arbiters of truth that they once were or of discovery. Twitter can be used, as David has just illustrated there, as a weapon, as a lynch mob, as a way of getting people out of their jobs. It is also the foremost sort of forum, if you like, for free thought, for new ideas in areas like politics, philosophy, economics, where ideas can actually be shared far more easily than they can be done in academic circles. Now, this might not be stuff that comes to the fore, but it is there. This is where a lot of political movements now are fermented. And this is why it's incredibly important to recognise that on the one hand, whilst it can be used as a way of sort of whipping up and, destructive power, it is also an incredibly powerful, creative tool. And that is why, ultimately, I do think that it's very important that it is controlled by somebody with a more sort of, if you like, absolutist vision about something like free speech, rather than Wall Street, which is what Jack Dorsey, the creator, said it was created by, which has its own interests and is more than happy to destroy based on what the bottom line comes down to. The question will now be, what do the employees of Twitter do, who are the ones who have been, very much sort of involved in orchestrating the cancelling, the pylons, this, that and the other? How is it that they... Sorry.
That's quite a sharp statement to say.
No, that is
the staff of Twitter have orchestrated pylons.
Facilitating, perhaps. The setup of Twitter is currently so that
the promotion, algorithmic promotion of potentially extreme views.
I'm not saying that those people are the ones doing it themselves, but they have created an environment.
I'm not so sure. If you look at their reaction to Elon Musk and the kind of things they've been saying, there's a very, very strong prima facie case that they are.
There is,
and that it's high time that these awful little censors were taken down.
Here's what I don't understand is if I see there's a completely intellectually coherent case for saying that we should have a free speech platform in which people should be able to say what they like.
Sounds a bit like GBNews.
Indeed. Yes. Completely understand that. But if that's the case...
That's what we're doing,
that means that... that means freedom of speech for people who want to say, I hate Jewish people. It means freedom of speech for people who want to say, in tens of thousands, that David Starkey is an evil psychopath. Even though you're not, or who want to say that you should be sacked, and it means people being able to say that trans women are women or that they aren't women. Freedom of speech has to be uncomfortable because it means freedom of speech for people you find grotesque and awful. And for me, it's right for the boundary to be on action. So I would absolutely levy criticism at editorial rooms who are saying that they will or won't do things on the basis of Twitter storms. But it's the action, it's sacking people on the basis of free speech noise. You have to accept, if you have free speech, it comes with noise and chaos and raucousness.
And consequence.
And also, but horror.
And
awful people saying awful things in huge volumes.
One little thing that is very different, though, isn't it? There is a specific...
Make it a very little thing, so I need to go to a break in a second.
There's a specific feature on Twitter which enables the Twitter storm to happen, which is just pressing that one like button and it goes everywhere. It is this viral quality of the thing. Now, that is actually something that Musk, as a brilliant technologist, could deal with and should deal with.
Well, there you go. I was going to talk to you about bank holidays, but I got a little bit carried away talking about free speech. Anyway, I enjoyed that. I hope you did. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk to you about Prevent, actually, the anti-terrorism programme. It's been criticised. We'll be looking at why. I'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Coming up on Dan Wootton tonight, why are only Western nations being vilified for past outrages? Madness of Crowds author Douglas Murray sought to discover the answer to this question in his important new book, The War on the West. He'll reveal his findings on the woke mission to warp history live. Plus, Nigel Farage and Darren Grimes give their unfiltered takes on the issues that matter to you, and I'll break down the headlines with my superstar panel, including Daily Star editor and current columnist Dawn Neeson and conservative commentator Calvin Robinson. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Kerr.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
Make sure that you join us Monday to Thursday, 10 a.m. until midday, right here on GB News for To The Point.
We're not afraid to talk about the topics that matter to you or the big topics that always matter.
We cover absolutely everything, from the breaking political stories of the day to law and order, what's going on in the channel. We're not afraid to hold people to account.
We always make sure we include your views on our show.
Indeed, if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we're saying it. So make sure you join the conversation with us, 10 a.m. until midday, Monday to Thursday, for To The Point on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello there, welcome back to Dewbs and Co with me, Michelle Dewberry. Coming up at 7, Nigel Farage will be live from Westminster. Nigel, good evening to you. What's coming up in your show?
Well, David Cameron saying something sensible for once seems worthy of debate. GPs reducing the hours their surgeries are open, I think is going to further enrage a public who I feel are falling out of love quite quickly with the NHS. And joining me on Talking Pints, the man that the rich and famous fear, the biographer Tom Bower, who I'm sure will have some very interesting stories for us.
Nigel Farage, I will be watching. I'll see you at 7. Thanks for that. Well, he mentioned there, didn't he, David Cameron saying something sensible. I wonder if he was alluding to this, because David Cameron has claimed that people who oppose the government's anti-extremist prevent strategy are fuelling terrorism. David Cameron has written the foreword to a report by the think tank Policy Exchange. The report calls for more support for the Prevent plan. This, of course, comes after the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has hinted that changes would be made following the murder of the MP, Sir David Amess. Apparently, it claims that there is an Islamophobic social engineering project by groups arguing that they are victims of Prevent. Well, let's get into this, shall we? Joining me now is Chris Phillips, who's the former head of the National Counter-Terrorism Security Office. Help us understand, first and foremost, briefly, what is Prevent?
Good evening, Michelle. Well, Prevent is actually part of the counter-terrorism strategy for the UK. It's one of the 4 Ps, and its aim is to stop people killing other people because of radicalisation, being radicalised, but also committing suicide in doing that often. So it's about protecting people. It's about turning people away from radicalisation. And it has had a lot of successes, but clearly quite a few failures as well.
And what do you think to David Cameron, what he's suggesting now?
Well, I certainly think that this strategy has worked. My own view is that it needs to be hardened up. There's lots of gaps in it, and we've seen those gaps actually come to the fore recently with terrorist attacks, where people have pretty much almost told their person that they're not radicalised anymore, so therefore they were allowed to get on and then went on to commit terrorist attacks. So it does need to be worked on. I think it needs a lot of improvements. There's a big issue around de-radicalisation in prisons, which is not working, and I think there's lots to be done, but we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater to say that it shouldn't exist at all.
So David Cameron, I mean, he's specifically accusing certain Muslim groups who are criticising Prevent as, I quote, enabling terrorism. Is that fair?
Yeah. Quite rightly so, because there are groups of people that don't want Prevent to be part of the government. They don't see, or they see that they're being picked on and that they should be able to deal with this themselves. But of course, they've been seen to fail in that. So I think it's quite right that the government, the police, social workers have a big part to play. And I think there's a great deal of work to be done. And we've had people released from prison who are still radicalised and out there on the streets. And of course, what we've seen with the recent murder of David MS is that there's people that should really have had more detailed preventative measures in place, but we didn't, because I think it's probably underfunded.
OK, interesting. Chris Phillips, thanks for your time. Benedict, you know, whenever you try and set something like Prevent up, you will always get criticism. There'll be certain people saying it's racist. There'll be certain people saying it's too soft, it's too hard. Where's the fine line? Where's the balance?
I mean, the first thing to point out about Prevent is that last year there were more people who were white, working-class young men referred to Prevent than anything else for links to far-right extremism. That's the first thing that does need to be taken into account. It is not something that disproportionately targets ethnic minorities and hasn't been for some time. The other thing I think that needs to be borne in mind is very often people will point out that people of migrant backgrounds and migrant communities tend to be of a lower sort of social standing in society, almost by definition, because they come with less ability to sort of hoist themselves up, so they end up in poverty more often than not, or at least, you know, they do for a time before they're able to lift themselves up. So you're always going to get people who are more prone to end up being radicalised, who find themselves in more desperate situations. So why it would be then that people would sit there and look at this reality, which is that very often migrants find themselves in a very tough spot, with this thing that corresponds with finding yourself in a very tough spot, and then say, well, this is evidence of the system that tries to prevent radicalisation being racist. That doesn't really stand up to me. It does sound ever so slightly like an element of sort of seeking grievance. And we do actually have to recognise that as much as, you know, far-right politics is a very major issue, probably the biggest cause of terrorism in Europe at the moment is radical Islamism. There's no getting away from that. And who tends to, you know, be turned to radical Islamism? People who come from already Muslim backgrounds, or people who are immediately converted, who tend to be of a sort of a working class and very poverty-stricken background. There's actually no getting away from those facts. So to then throw the system out and say, well, it's a racist system because there are a very large number of ethnic minorities within it, that, I think, is to just completely ignore the underlying economic situation of so many people who find themselves there.
Polly?
I think a lot of what Benedict says is completely right. But what's happened today is that David Cameron has picked a fight with some quite obscure, actually, Muslim groups who he says are trying to sort of pick apart Prevent. When Prevent isn't going to be picked apart, it's going to continue. It's going to continue its work correctly, trying to minimise the Islamist threat. But the crucial thing to understand about counterterrorism is that the most fundamental part of it is community intelligence. You have to get people who are worried about their brother, their cousin, their uncle, to raise a flag to the teacher, to the local authority, to get people referred into the system. And that means that communities have to trust it. At the moment, we're in a really good place on Prevent. Muslim communities and non-Muslim communities have basically, within the margin of error, the same views about Prevent. They both want Prevent to succeed. Muslims don't want to be blown up. They don't want to be associated with Islamism either. And so actually that's a really safe, good place for us to be if we want Prevent to be successful, because it needs wide support from all of society. I think turning this into a polarised debate and trying to kind of elevate this story about, oh, Muslims are going around saying it's racist, in the end is probably unhelpful thing for a former Prime Minister to do. I can understand why he's done it. Of course, there are some people who say that Prevent is racist and it should be shut down. Why big up those voices? Why make a fuss out of them when actually most Muslims support Prevent and they're right to do so?
I mean, what David Cameron's saying, David, is that in his view, people who oppose the government's strategy were fueling terrorism because they were, I quote, afraid to appear racist. What do you think to all this?
There has to be a measure of truth in that. I mean, if you look at the Manchester bomber was allowed to proceed, we know explicitly, because at least one security guard noticed a man of a particular colour with a very large rucksack on his back and said, ooh, I better not do anything about this because I might be called racist. But I think the problem of Islamism, racism and whatever, it's wrong, as it were, to talk, I know this sounds bizarre, to talk to the Muslim community about it. What we should be doing is having a much broader conversation on the way the term racism has been stretched absurdly. And that seems to me to be the big issue. And I mean, I'm very struck by what Polly said, and I see the deep sense of it. So, but we do need a much broader conversation, that the way in which the slightest infraction you get immediately, dare I say, the Twitter storm or the treatment that I received, of course it intimidates people. It silences them. It also gives something else which is very dangerous. It gives licenses of misbehaviour. Would, for example, if the lyrics of Swampy were written by a white man, would Cambridge accept the donation from him? No, they would not. And so, we have, it's a discussion nobody wants to have. It's dangerous, it's difficult, there are pitfalls for every politician, but we need it. And again, look at the absurd reaction to David Amos's death. What did politicians do? Because they're so frightened about talking about either the racist or the Muslim or the Islamic element of the thing, element of the thing. What do? They all say we must clamp down on naughty things being said on Twitter. I mean, the most complete derangement or diversionary syndrome.
Well, this happened, though, didn't it? We talked about David Amos in the intro to this. I remember when he was, horrifically killed, and straight away the conversation turned to exactly the point that you're making. You've just had an MP stabbed brutally to death, and then people are over here saying we shouldn't be horrible to each other on Twitter.
I think part of the reason for that, there's part of it that's justified, though I hear the criticism, is that lots of MPs receive a lot of death threats. Lots of them are on Twitter. And so that's their instant thought, is that feeling that those death threats are not just trivial abuse that I could kind of ignore. Actually, I'm right to genuinely feel frightened. And of course, narratives in these contexts are set very quickly. And I was actually here with you that very evening. It was horrific, Michelle.
Yes, but, you were, that's right.
But it was a few hours before we had any idea that it was an Islamist attack.
And then, of course,
and so you can understand.
But everybody then fell over themselves to say that it wasn't.
Yeah.
In other words, the point is although when you dare one say it, look at newspapers that publish photographs of suspects and those who don't. And there has been this extraordinary diversionary tactic. It is felt that this thing called community cohesion. Look again at the whole Rotherham child abuse scandal. In area after area, walking on eggshells has led to disaster.
But it's also true that the right was very cautious about accepting that the man who murdered Joe Cox was associated with far-right terrorism.
But these sensitivities, and I've just quickly checked because I've just had something floating into my head as I was listening to you, and I was wanting to fact-check myself before I opened my mouth, because I thought I could remember this, and I've just checked, and it is true. Some years ago, 2015, 2016, Greater Manchester Police, they came out and apologised. I don't know if anyone can remember this. They were almost doing training for a suicide attack. And what they did was in the Manchester Trafford Centre, they mocked up this terror attack to train their staff in how to deal with it. Somebody shouted Allah Akbar at the start of it. And there were all kinds of complaints, and Greater Manchester Police had to come out and apologise.
Eggshells. It's a walking on eggshells.
I actually find that there's a wonderful symmetry to all of this because we started
it has to be the quickest symmetry ever because I've got 10 seconds.
We started talking about a multipolar world. This is entirely actually a lot of this comes from the sort of the fractious and highly racialised nature of debate in the United States, where everything is about race. That's how
there you go.
Put those two stories together.
That is fascinating. You'll have to tell me the rest in the break. That's all I've got time for. Thank you very much. Got to say, so many emails tonight saying you've enjoyed the panel. So did I, David Starkey, Benedict Spence, Polly Mackenzie. Thank you very much. If you missed tonight's show or bits of it, you can catch it on a podcast. I tell you, we're everywhere. Have a good night, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Hello again. Clearing skies overnight will lead to a touch of frost in some places, but after that chilly start, actually Wednesday's looking mostly dry and bright once again because high pressure is here and it's here to stay for some time. It's building in from the north. Now that means because winds rotate around high pressure in a clockwise direction, we're seeing an easterly airflow, but actually the isobars are opening out at the same time, so those winds are falling lighter and we're going to see the cloud mostly fade away overnight. Still some patches remaining, drifting south across the Midlands, East Anglia in the southeast, some across western Scotland. But where we see those clear spells for, say, northern England, for much of Scotland, some sheltered spots will get just below freezing. Otherwise, typical numbers first thing Wednesday morning will be 4 to 7 degrees. So chilly start, that frost around first thing, but quite quickly it'll warm up. The sun will get to work. And it's looking much sunnier for northern and eastern England, for much of eastern Scotland compared to Tuesday. It's still going to feel on the cool side, particularly on the east coast with the breeze coming from the North Sea. But I think with a lighter wind and with more sunshine, it's going to feel pleasant enough. 15 or 16 in the south, 8 to 9 on the east coast of Scotland and eastern England. Now into Wednesday nights, more lengthy clear spells and lighter winds again. So I think a more widespread frost, still in places like Cardiff, London, Southampton, 6 or 7 degrees. But in sheltered spots, away from urban centres, those temperatures getting close to, if not below freezing. So a frost on Thursday morning, but another dry and bright start to the day. Another fine day for the vast majority. Just some rain drifting past the Northern Isles there. Otherwise, for much of the country, it's sunny spells, some cloud floating by. And for Friday, a bit more cloud in the sky, but Saturday the sunshine returns, particularly in the southern half of the UK.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dewbs and Co. Me and my panel will get stuck right into